Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webcast, Why the Return to the Office Can Kill Microsoft Teams Performance, and of course, how to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm your host, Microsoft MVP, Nick Cavalanci. I'm glad you joined us today. It's a really interesting topic because there's a lot of organizations just like yours that is trying to figure out how to navigate bringing users back into the office as we're sort of maybe turning towards a post-COVID at least viewpoint of the world in some places, and trying to figure out how to make a hybrid workforce kind of work for those organizations. And so it's really important to be thinking about this proactively. So I'm really glad that you're in the webcast today. We've got a great presentation today. Got a great set of speakers I want to introduce you to as well. First up, one of our very first speakers I want to show you is Cam Smith. Cam is the Senior Product Marketing Manager for Teamwork in Microsoft Canada. Cam, thanks for joining me today. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Nick. Super excited. Really love this topic. Can't wait to get into it.
Yeah, no, we had a great conversation with Cam beforehand, and he's super excited about Teams and knows everything about it. So glad you're here. We've also got with us Rob Giussette. He's the VP of Product Management at Martello. Rob, we've done a bunch of these together. Thanks again for joining me.
Thanks, Nick. Happy to be here.
Yeah, glad you're here. And so our agenda today is relatively simple. What we want to do is we want to start with just looking at the need to be thinking about this hybrid work performance and thinking about how you're going to approach hybrid work and do it now. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why the performance of Microsoft Teams is really, really critical. It's not just about Teams availability. It's actually about service level. It's about service delivery. It's about the user's experience. All those things are going to come into play and why that's important. Then we're going to talk about 3 real-world challenges here that your organization is going to face as you move users back to the office, more than likely. And then we're going to talk just a little bit, and Rob's going to show us a little bit about ways to monitor Teams performance as well. So if that sounds good, I'm going to first hand the reins over to Cam, who's going to kind of talk about this issue of hybrid work preparedness and sort of the shift to hybrid work. So Cam, would you start us off and talk a little bit about this, please?
For sure, Nick. Thanks. And hey, everyone, thanks for being here today. I've spent about 15 years in technology and training, adoption change management, product marketing on the technical side as well. And it has been a wild ride. I will say right from the beginning of the pandemic, I can recall being on webinars where we were training 2,500, 3,000 end users at a time overnight to be deployed on Teams within a 24-hour period when this whole thing started rolling. And so it's really interesting now to see the ways in which organizations are preparing for this sort of like new hybrid return to work types of scenarios out there, both on the technical side, but also on the people side. We've also done a lot of studies during this time, a lot of it internal. So, we've done global internal Microsoft employee studies on like what the different habits are of remote work, what it means to have a hybrid environment. And there's sort of 3 areas that we start seeing this sort of return to work scenario move into. One is the hybrid paradox. Hybrid paradox is that everybody wants the flexibility of what they got working from home. Well, they also want the collaboration and freestyle approach of working with others in the office when it comes to creating good ideas, having innovation, bouncing ideas off one another. And that's a really hard thing to reconcile in that type of experience you can give employees. And the second one is, what is that experience like? What does it look like when it comes to your offices, what your employees have at home, how they interact with one another? When you have a bunch of people that are there in person, and then you have a bunch of people individually that are remote, how do you create an inclusive environment that makes sure you're creating as close as you can to the real type of environment that allows for innovation and creativity? And then, finally, the hybrid workplace, the physical places where people are spending their time together, and making sure that that environment is safe, is collaborative, has the right pieces of technology and the right infrastructure to go and support it. And these are the 3 areas that we see every customer out there super interested right now in learning more about when it comes to Microsoft Teams as sort of the platform that they're going to use moving forward in this hybrid environment. When we start taking that a level further down, we start seeing a variety of different thought processes for that physical workplace that leaders within different organizations are thinking about. The first one are company policies. These are very much HR specific. Is this, hey, I'm going to mandate people to come back to the office twice a week, 3 days they can work remotely. Hey, I'm going to make sure everyone has to have a declaration form when they come in, that they're symptom-free from a COVID perspective. And then things actually get really interesting on this space where you start thinking about the culture. My team recently did this at Microsoft Canada, where we started discussing what's the culture and expectations when we get to go back to the office? Do you really need to, hold yourself true to the new Teams feature that's coming that says you can select when you're accepting a meeting if it's going to be in person or if it's going to be digital? So stuff like that. The next one are the physical spaces. Like, what are those meeting rooms like? So in the past, you would have seen a meeting room where obviously there was a table and then there were chairs around that table and there was a single TV at the end. Now, if you have a single TV at the end that's taking up the physical space of one chair, and then you have 8 people in the room that are sitting around that, you're representing the entire remote set of users that are part of that meeting in that single one chair space with the traditional physical space. Now, if you look at the office of the future and you look at the hybrid workplace, and this is just one example of many, and we're going to get into a little bit more here, but now you're thinking half that room maybe should be a television or several TVs. And the features and functionality of how people in that room are interacting is that you should expect 50% to be remote and expect the environment to reflect that and the way in which they can be collaborative. And then the last one, which I think is the most important, and this is sort of the behind the scenes infrastructure that supports everything. And this is what I'm super excited about Martello to sort of get into today, and that's the infrastructure. And there's a wide variety of different areas where this infrastructure comes to bear on the overall end user experience as people get back into the office. So as we get a little bit deeper into the infrastructure, you start thinking about just sort of where we were before the pandemic. If we can jump to the next spot there, Rob. And then where we are. So, if we look at before the pandemic, we had 75 million, or actually like even partway into the pandemic, we had 75 million users. The previous year before that, it was like 45 million. Today, we have 145 million daily active users on Teams. We look at Microsoft's recent year-over-year earnings that were released, we have 50% year-over-year cloud revenue growth. So that is a lot of information moving to the cloud that has to pass through a lot of different points to get to end users that are able to consume and use that data in a productive way. And we start seeing this sort of scenario when we start thinking about not just like people chatting on Teams or storing files in OneDrive, but when we start seeing the amount of signals out there from security areas, compliance areas, protecting an organization, people collaborating and working with each other, people sharing documents with each other, people shifting their entire ecosystem from an on-prem server to in the cloud and hopefully Azure sometimes. You start seeing a massive increase of data from where we were to where we are now and to where we're going to go. And that requires a massive infrastructure to support it. So when we start thinking about the return to office, Teams ends up being this window into all that data. It ends up being this place where people are going to be accessing their files, storing their files with SharePoint on the back end, chatting with one another, meeting with one another. And that increase in that data traffic can really slow things down when you start getting back into physical spaces. And when you start thinking about how remote employees interact with employees at the office and the infrastructure behind that, you can run into a lot of trouble if things aren't ready to go. And one of the things that we're seeing that's really important is that there's this moment in time right now, and it'll pass us by because people will get back into the office. If you're from Canada right now, you're seeing like those plans start to come to fruition, leaders within organizations starting to release what the policies will be. So there's this moment where if we're going to run into trouble, there's time to fix it now, so that when folks get back to the office, some of the larger areas that could cause issues in the way in which the infrastructure of an organization's network traffic flows can be solved ahead of time. It's a lot harder to solve things as they're being broken in real time as people are back. And that's why I'm super excited about this topic today and the ways in which Martello has some of the solutions and some of the ideas, which I think is also important, on how you can make sure that the Teams experience for users as they move into this hybrid work environment is the same, if not better, than the one they've had over the last couple of years if they've been working from home. So hopefully that gives you a bit of insight into what Microsoft's perspective on this has been. We've had a lot of customers asking about this. We've done a lot of research on it. We're confident that the experience is going to be hybrid as we move forward, and that'll become the norm. So being ready for it with all these areas that I've talked about today is going to be paramount to success for the overall user experience as you get people back into the office. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Cam. That's actually fantastic, sort of setting the context here. Because as I think about the future, I even think about just some of the changes that have occurred, let's say in the last year, like the support for direct routing and the PSTN integration, and that's part of this idea of hybrid work, as you have PSTN and you're having your telephony infrastructure and that kind of thing. Very excited about Microsoft Mesh. That's coming down the pike at some point. That's going to be very cool. And just on a side note, as you were talking about the one TV representing, all the remote people, you kind of reminded me of I don't know if you're this geeky or not. I'm assuming that you are, but
I
like
am.
the Avengers movies, and when they talk to the people in the World Council, and they've got one screen for each person, so they're sort of represented in the room, as opposed to I was thinking about in modern day, if it was really what we're doing today, you would have had Samuel Jackson's character looking at like a little TV screen, with little icons of people or something, as opposed to these big people in front of him. So yeah, I think the Avengers have a leg up on most organizations today.
100%. The Avengers meeting rooms are off the hook.
Yes, and that's the goal in some ways, and probably with Mesh, I think we'll probably get there. And you make an interesting point there, because these advances in technology and the advances in dependency really are going to impact performance. And I should mention, by the way, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning, doing some housekeeping. We are recording this, and people are asking in the Q&A box, which I do have open in front of me. So we are recording this. You will be sent a link. And if you have any questions, all the stuff that Cam was talking about, you have a real good opportunity to ask someone right from Microsoft a question about Teams. Again, he's very knowledgeable about this, as well as anything that Rob and I are talking about. Stick that in the Q&A box. Be happy to try and either interject those questions in here, or actually doing it formally at the end, about 10 minutes at the end of today's session. So I'll try and make sure we answer as many questions as we can today as we're talking about this. Now, I put up on this slide here a couple things here. And Rob, I want to talk about this with you. And then Cam, I definitely would love for you to interject anything and everything you can think of that sort of is relevant here from the Microsoft perspective. And Teams, like any other platform, has some set of minimum technical specs. I mean, it has to have some level of bandwidth, throughput, in order to maintain a great experience. And so you see some of those things here, like, for instance, we're going to talk about this a little bit on another slide, having a direct connection between the user and the Microsoft 365 cloud, with nothing in between, at least hindering the way, if you will. Certainly some bandwidth minimums, and I put some quality of service recommendations that even Microsoft makes on the very specific kinds of like video content and audio content and that sort of thing. And then a lack of third-party solutions getting in the way, maybe like security scanning and that kind of thing as an example. And the idea here is, with those things being wrong, or being in place and kind of adding to the latency that exists between the user and Teams, because you even heard Cam say there's a lot of sort of, I'm going to put words in your mouth, I use some other word, but there's a lot of factors that come into play between the user, let's say on their laptop at home or even in the office, and when they finally get to the Microsoft cloud and to the servers providing the Teams service. And so you end up with a number of repercussions. You can see them at the bottom of the screen here. You see, of course, disruption. And I put disrupted operations as sort of a broad swath of, it could be anything from my Teams is slow, or the phone calls keep breaking up, or the video looks horrible, or whatever it is. But the idea here is, keep in mind that in most cases, even Microsoft isn't perfect. They're a company like any other, can have an outage or a service drop or something like that. But most cases, it's not Microsoft. It's something between here and there that's actually causing the problem. And so just saying, the call's crap, it's not necessarily Teams. It's probably more something within your organization, how the user's connecting on their Wi-Fi, what kind of connectivity do they have, if they're going through a VPN, are there solutions in place, and there's weird routing inside the organization, all those kinds of things, as well as how they egress from the organization out to the Microsoft cloud. All that plays a role in this process. And then on top of that, things like just the normal stuff, the other repercussions, the loss of productivity. The user wasn't able to get the information they needed. I've literally been on calls where I'm hearing, I'm sure Rob and Cam, you've both done these before, where you heard like you're one of those, and you're like, well, I can't, tell you what, can we just have another call another time, or can you try calling back in? And you're losing this productivity over something as dumb as, I can't understand the words coming out of your mouth. And so that comes to play, and of course, just a higher total cost of ownership. And so, Rob, I thought where we would start, and again, Cam, would love you to interject as well. I wrote down a couple of questions here I wanted to ask you. And so I've been thinking about, as you're talking to prospective customers over the last couple of years, because Martello's been involved with Teams and Microsoft 365 monitoring for a number of years now, how has the discussion changed around how much Microsoft 365 and then specifically Teams, of course, is a priority for the business?
Yeah, well, I think you pointed out the key being there's a lot of factors, and in many cases, those factors also represent some blind spots or lack of visibility for IT to understand how those factors are actually performing, whether that's the user's endpoint, the user's local network, the internet, the ISP that's being used, is there VPN in play, cloud proxies, the Microsoft data centers, a lot of different factors in play, like you said, and really the tools haven't evolved alongside that to provide clear visibility into those sets of factors. You might have visibility into one or two of them, but to have visibility across the whole stack has become a challenge. And I think we've really seen, as we've kind of gone through the last couple of years, we transitioned from people being in well-tuned office networks back to home. IT scrambling to deal with, now essentially instead of having lots of people in a small number of offices, you have lots of people in a large number of offices where essentially you've got one person in each office. That introduced some significant challenges for IT. And now, oddly enough, as we're looking to go back into offices again, there are some behaviors, some good behaviors that have happened through the course of the pandemic where adoption of Teams has exploded. People are now coming back to the office with the same expectation that Teams is going to work just as it did at home, where they had, in many cases, sole access to their network bandwidth. And now they're finding that there are a whole other set of challenges as people return to the office, whether that's, saturating the bandwidth and things like that.
I put a list of poor performance, sort of repercussions. What are you seeing with customers? I mean, these are really high level, and obviously it's a non-exhaustive list. But what else are you seeing specifically with customers where when they're having performance issues, what's the impact on the business?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, like you said, loss of productivity and a higher cost of ownership. It's, IT has to spend a significant amount of time with those employees to kind of get to the root of what's happening, through the course of which the employee continues to suffer from productivity losses. And it's back to, I think, those tools where, you're trying to capture data after the fact. Okay, I had this bad call 2 hours ago, and now I'm trying to gather data with IT to explain what happened 2 years ago, or 2 hours ago. But the reality is the conditions of the network have changed, things have changed on my laptop, and so on. And so there's a lot of wasted time spinning your wheels, trying to get data, trying to troubleshoot the issue. And through the course of that, like you said, you're unable to have a meaningful call with somebody. And if you're a revenue generating or customer facing individual in the organization, that's a costly exercise as the hours tick by going through that troubleshooting process.
No, totally agree. And Cam, just to make sure that people realize here, because you touched on this a little bit, Rob, it's not like Microsoft has nothing that tells you what's going on with Teams performance. That's not the case here. So you comment on that just a little bit here about what's available?
We do.
I mean,
yeah, we have several out of the box solutions. Like we've got call quality dashboard. Like there's a variety of tools that we have that plug directly in. Some of them on some of the more advanced SKUs, but you are definitely able to go and look at various different dashboards for what the different quality is when it comes to connectivity with Microsoft Teams. The thing I'll say though is like every organization is different, right? And so if you're going to want to go and get a customized view of the exact things that you think might be the biggest barriers to overall success of safe data flow, then that's where you're going to want to go out and get something customized, because you also got to weigh, the cost versus benefits value proposition of something customized, because it might be way more cost effective for you as far as how much time you spend with this if you get a customized view that is feeding you the data points that you think will make the biggest difference the fastest in ensuring a high network quality and resolving bandwidth issues when it comes to using these things. So I think the solutions we have are great for a lot of organizations out there. I think any organization that really wants to get into the nitty gritty of solving problems quickly, making sure the areas they know they might have gaps are the areas that come to the surface the fastest with the way in which they're looking at monitoring their networks, that's where a customized solution is super valuable.
I totally agree. So let's do this. We want to cover on today's webcast sort of 3 use cases of where you're going to have challenges. as you move users back to some kind of hybrid workforce as they return to work. And the first one is just that the network itself is not designed with Teams in mind. This is actually a screenshot, or I grabbed this image, I should say, right off of Microsoft's recommendations for how the architecture or the environment should look like for Teams. And what you'll see here basically is, although it's a lot of lines, if you look at any one kind of starting point, these are sort of gray boxes, whether they represent someone's in a hotel, their home office, a particular head office, a coffee shop, whatever, if you follow that line to the Microsoft 365 cloud and presumably Teams, it's direct. That's what I mentioned on the last slide. Somebody even asked, what do I mean by direct connection? This is what I mean by direct connection. This is what Microsoft wants. They want is close to just the user connecting to the internet and going to the Microsoft cloud as is possible. What ends up happening, though, if you take a look at this next image that I've got for you, you'll see that it actually doesn't look like that for most organizations. It's probably something that looks more like this, where if you start at the upper left, for example, you've got the hotel, the coffee shop, the home office, and those people are using a VPN to connect in, which is adding a layer of encryption on there, which certainly helps with privacy and security and things like that. But it also adds some latency because it's got to be processed, and then it's got to be encrypted on one end, decrypted on the other. Then it goes through the organization's network, where there can be, for example, Microsoft said there should be no hairpin turns. Like, don't have one office have to route all their traffic to another office to then go out to the internet, kind of a thing. That's a hairpin turn. And you also see kind of in the very center a list of different kinds of solutions that are very common for organizations to have in place, that each one is doing some kind of scanning of the traffic perhaps, or proxying the traffic to go to another place, or whatever the case is. But each one of those things adds latency, and it also sort of, I'm going to call it, misdirects, in the spirit of a direct connection. It misdirects the traffic to go somewhere other than just directly from the user to the Microsoft cloud. And so this kind of becomes the real challenge for organizations, is if yours looks something like this, and more than likely it probably does to some degree, because it was never designed or specifically to go, hey, how does Microsoft want us to design our network? What do they think? I mean, and rightly so, because that's not your focus point. But as you've shifted to using Microsoft 365 and using the Office 365 tools, using Teams and so on, your organization's operations have changed focus. They've shifted now to where I think it's really important. That's why I hope you're on this call proactively enough to be thinking about, okay, we probably need to re-architect at least some portion of this. At a minimum, some VPNs will support setting up a hybrid configuration. So anything that needs to route internally goes internally. Anything that doesn't, like let's say Microsoft, will go directly out to Microsoft and skip going through the corporate network. Like at least doing something like that. That kind of re-architecture would at least help the process here. Now, Rob, just I have a couple questions written down as I was thinking about each of these use cases. So I've got this here, and maybe to help the audience sort of somewhat understand what they probably don't even know is going to happen yet about their environment. Has this been a big problem for customers thus far as they've been transitioning to return to work? So to that, the last slide to this slide, last slide being ideal, this is being probably more the reality. How much of a problem has that been?
Well, I know that the example you just mentioned about the VPN is one we hear regularly, where an employee's been having a pretty good experience in a home network. They've started to transition back into their office network, and now all of a sudden the performance is significantly degraded, and they don't know why. And that's some of the things that we've helped sort of diagnose that traffic flow, to look and see, okay, where is the traffic going? And we saw in cases that the traffic was going to a very undesirable location in terms of the geographical distance that was taking, because that office had a VPN, a persistent VPN connection back to their head office, and as such, their traffic got routed to the other side of the world, which you can imagine resulted in a pretty poor Teams experience.
Yeah, you don't want an office in LA routing traffic to, let's say, the Paris, France headquarters to then go back to a US-based entry point into the Microsoft cloud. Cam, you've done onboarding and helping organizations with adoption for the last number of years in Teams. How much of this do you see regularly?
I mean, it's the number one thing that contributes to a sort of loss in end user experience when it comes to Teams out there, like hands down. But when you have to explain this sort of outside of a technical audience, my favorite analogy for this is don't build dams, build filters when it comes to your traffic flow, right? Like, you can't build a big giant wall and then expect all the water to flow through it the same way on the other end. That's just not possible. But filters are designed to do that. So you definitely need the right filters when it comes to privacy, when it comes to data protection, when it comes to hackers out there right now, and the massive rise on ransomware that's hitting a lot of customers out there, a lot of people globally. So you need the right filters. But if you build dams, there's no way that your end user doesn't suffer from that overall experience. And to me, that analogy makes the most sense, because you can't always have every industry out there, some of them highly regulated on their data requirements, that can completely ditch like a VPN or an on-premise network. Like, that's not always possible. But I think, Nick, you said it right at the beginning, some of that stuff definitely probably could transition over. Some of the ways in which that data flows could. So as much as you want to build filters instead of dams.
No, I totally agree. And this is one of those things where, I mean, I've been in IT for 28 years. And one of the things that I learned very early on is there was always this balance between security and productivity. The simplest example just being, if you want to say, we need everyone to access whatever they need. Okay, great. Make everybody administrator. I mean, in theory, they would access everything they need, right? But you're not very secure. That's one end of the spectrum where the scale is sort of teetering one way. But then if you go the other way and go, no, we're going to lock everybody down. And I mean, we're obviously trying to get to that with zero trust and find a way to do that with productivity in mind. But if you just went to the total other end of the spectrum and just locked everybody down, people aren't able to get access to the things they need to be productive. And so we're finding the same thing here, where those services that are in the middle there, and you see things like, a next gen firewall, a CASB, and we've got an IPS solution, DLP, and so on and so forth. Those things are all necessary to help secure the environment. Ransomware, great example, Cam, happening like crazy today. You obviously want to be secure. It's more about trying to find that balance of how can you be secure, but also make sure the environment's productive. Rob, can you show us a little bit about what Martello can maybe help with here as far as monitoring in order to detect some of this and where the architecture is at fault?
Yeah, definitely. So I've carved out a couple scenarios here to reinforce the use cases we'll go through. And when it comes to, whether it's employees shifting from offices to home or back, hopefully home to back to offices again, the first thing that's really important is providing visibility into the experience of those users, so those workers. So I have an example here where I'm using Ottawa and Boston as two locations, and I have visibility into how well is the performance from a team's perspective for those users or those employees, whether they're at home or in the office. And so I have these modeled out. I can drill into, for instance, the Ottawa workers who are now back into an office. And if I drill in here, first thing I want to call out is the way these dashboards are being generated is completely dynamic. And there's a number of options here. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but we can do this based on the IP addresses that are expected from your office, by locations. There's lots of different ways we can do this. But the nice thing is the end result is, as users transition from at home work environment to an in the office work environment, these dashboards will be up to date, and you can track accurately how that performance is being measured. So we can drill into these. We can see which users are part of my Ottawa group here. You can drill into any one of these and get an overview of what is their experience like in the office, including the type of device that they're using, performance characteristics, overview of their experience. I can actually drill in and see which devices they're using in the Ottawa office here. So if I drill into this particular example here, I get a breakdown of whether or not these calls are happening on Wi-Fi, what sort of bandwidth was available to the user. Let me click on this one, sorry, here. What was the ISP that was used? So quite a bit of detail here. Cam made reference to the call quality dashboards that Microsoft publishes. The advantage here is that Martello is consuming the data from the same data that's used for those call quality dashboards. So from a user perspective, all a user needs to do is log in here, configure some credentials to their tenant. We'll pull in all that call quality data. We have a few other data sources through Graph and the like, where we can start painting these pictures for everyone. So you kind of know at a high level who's having a problem, and you can start to slice and dice it based on what makes sense for you. In this case, understanding the flow of users from home into an office. The other thing I wanted to call out here is, Cam mentioned how it's really important to get ahead of these problems before everyone, storms back into the office and they all run into the same problem on the same day, and you have this massive productivity problem. So we have the capability here around synthetic transactions, and these are, we call them robots, and they come pre-packaged with the intelligence for all the applications in the Microsoft 365 solution set. And once we decide what we want these robots to manage, let's say that's Teams in this case, we can start to establish a baseline of what that looks like. So I'll take a look at our Teams dashboard. And this is something that ideally you would put in place before users all start heading back to the office. So I put this robot in the office. Now I get a baseline of what's my MOS score. So these robots are going to behave like users do. They're going to hold video calls. They're going to send email. They're going to interact with OneDrive and SharePoint. And in the case of Teams, I get this baseline of my MOS score. And I get a detailed view of, for my offices where robots are deployed, what are the types of actions that these robots are running, and what is the performance of them. And the benefit here is that, once you have a baseline, as users start to return back to the office, you can measure the impact of that MOS score from that robot as users start to come back, right? Are we saturating the bandwidth? Are there issues that we need to deal with? And we'll be able to sort of keep a close eye on those as people start to return to the office. Last, I'm just going to jump back up to our top level view again here. Another important part of this is to be able to understand at a very high level, what is the overall experience for those groups of users, right? I'm comparing my Ottawa office workers to my Ottawa remote workers, or maybe even in-office worker experience across my various locations. I can generate an SLA view here that summarizes all the data sources that we can gather, whether that's the call quality data, that robot data I mentioned through some synthetic transactions. We'll get into a few other data sources through the course of these next use cases. All this data flows in, and we can measure quantitatively what the experience is like across all those office locations. So let's jump back to the deck here, and we'll get into the next.
It's interesting. Kasaba, one of our audience members, mentions here what I found as an issue as well. The users at home have a 1 gig internet connection, but when they come to the office with a 600 megabit internet connection for hundreds of users, and not just for Office 365 Teams traffic, it's like, well, yeah, duh, no, makes no sense. Perfect sense there. So, before we continue on, though, I'd like to put up a couple polls here, and just I got 2 of them for you guys in the audience here. And I just want to have, I'm going to put this up on the screen. You go ahead and interact with the screen directly. And I just want to know from your perspective, I'm just trying to get a little bit of feedback so we can tailor the rest of the conversation here today. Do you think that your environment is optimized to deliver that proper experience? And you see the options there of yes, I think so, no, and not even sure. Cam, I'm going to pick on you while we're waiting for the audience to sort of respond. I can see some votes coming in. What are you expecting to see as sort of the #1 selection here based on your experience with customers?
I think that we're going to see half I think so and half no, most likely. One of the challenges with this topic and what I call sort of is the invisible infrastructure of the office when it comes to Teams is you need funding for this stuff.
Yeah.
And so you need to be able to go and convey the importance of this to the leadership team within an organization, and how critical it is to productivity. Like, I think it shouldn't be lost that if you interrupt somebody's workflow for 10 minutes, you've lost about an hour and a half of their concentration on something, especially if they're a knowledge worker and you're requiring them to feel like they have the right tools in the toolbox to do their job. And so when you're going to say, hey, we need to spend a bunch of money on invisible things that you can't see, but are going to make a big difference to non-IT or non-technical audiences out there. It can be a challenge sometimes. Sometimes not. Sometimes everybody gets it, and it's really quick to go and invest the money to do so. But sometimes it's a bit of a challenge. And in an environment where you're seeing HR take sort of the focus area and physical safety take the focus area of the return to work policies of some organizations out there, your share of voice can be a little bit harder to pull in. And now I'm speculating. This is an example that I've seen with different customers out there. So your environment may be totally different. Your leadership team may be totally different. But I know that's been my experience sometimes where, we're talking about the physical safety, we're talking about the policies of the people, but maybe there's not as much of a conversation that should be had, on the invisible support system of how those employees are going to come back to the office.
Okay, so let me show these results here, and I'm going to say you're kind of right. And here's how you're kind of right. If you look at yes and I think so and add them together, you're at 51% or 50%. And if you look at no and not sure, you're at 50%. So you're kind of like spot on, even though it wasn't the I think so and the no answers. It's a half and half. You're exactly right there. So let me hide these. I'm going to put one more quick poll up here, and it's basically, do you think that you guys have the technology in place to monitor the team's user experience? We've talked about the call quality dashboard, some of the stuff out of the box. Some of you might have something homegrown. Again, you can go ahead and interact with the screen directly. And then just really quickly, Rob, while we're waiting for the answers to come in, what are you expecting to see as the answer here?
I would expect to be leaning into the no based on the conversations that we're having, where I really like the way that Cam phrases the infrastructure, right? You've got the stuff that people see and tend to get the focus, right? With the physical spaces, whether it's ventilation, the surfaces being cleaned, the desk layouts, all that kind of stuff. But then there's the invisible stuff we talked about all those factors that need to be working in tandem for a good team's user experience to happen. From what we're seeing is there's not a lot of visibility into how those factors are performing. And you've got little islands of visibility, but getting all of that in one view, is a challenge. So I would expect to see sort of a higher percentage of no here.
Yeah, let's go ahead and show those out. You're absolutely right. It's over 2/3 of people are saying they're not prepared yet. And so I'm actually glad that you're on this call today, because that's what this is really about. You can better understand and take some time and understand what the ramifications are going to be. So let me close this out. And let's go back to talking about the second use case here, which is basically the idea of not having this end-to-end visibility. Something like the call quality dashboard provides tremendous visibility, actually provides a fair level of breadth and depth to understanding what's going with call quality. But then if you're trying to think of the overall issue, and I'll just give the example of, let's say we've got, Rob, and I'm trying to support Rob, but Rob is a user that actually sometimes is in the office and sometimes is at home and is sometimes on the road. I kind of need to know exactly where Rob is. If Rob just goes, Teams is horrible today, and that's the help desk ticket, because that's usually about as descriptive as they are anyways, right? But it's like, well, where is Rob? What has changed between yesterday and today, right? That's what we want to know. And so having that end-to-end visibility is important. If you look at the diagram that I've kind of got at the bottom here, on the left, you've got the user wherever they happen to be. In the office, on the road, at home, in a coffee shop, in an airport, on an airplane, wherever it is, and then the Microsoft 365 Cloud, Teams over there on the right. And you look, and there's kind of three aspects here, three kind of parts. And I'm oversimplifying it, but it really makes the case here. You can see just within the environment that your organization and or your user controls, you have their own endpoint, which could be a personal endpoint. You have their connectivity, could be Wi-Fi, could be wired, could be their home, could be the office. It depends how they're connecting to the corporation, to the organizations, so maybe VPN, that kind of thing, any internal services, the routing, the traffic prioritization, all those things kind of come into play. And then you have the ISP, that where you're egressing from the organization. They have their own routing issues, their own latency issues. And then finally you have Microsoft, who is not, innocent in not having issues. They rarely have them, but it could be something with, maybe it's just authentication. Maybe it's not Teams at all. Maybe it's something with routing and the infrastructure. Maybe it's something with one of the Teams services, which of course includes Exchange to some degree. It includes OneDrive, SharePoint. There's a lot of what could be actually wrong with Teams, so to speak, where overall Teams is fine, but maybe OneDrive's having an issue, that kind of thing. And so it's more about functionality, like I can't do this one thing, as opposed to Teams is down, that would, like, the user's ever qualified to tell us the Teams is down. And so, this is one of the big challenges here. And so I'm wondering, Rob, maybe I've got, again, my questions here. Maybe can you walk through a couple quick examples of where maybe customers where Teams performance was suffering, and then what the actual cause was? So sort of, Teams is down, but it was actually just, one of those deals.
Yeah, and that's that sort of situation we call the logo blame game, right? Somebody has a bad Teams call, and they see Microsoft on the thing that they're using, and they blame Microsoft. But to your point, Microsoft, outside of the rare regional or global disruptions in service they may have, for the most part, keep a very well running service. And the stuff more to the left of this diagram is where most of the issues occur. I would say, undoubtedly over the last year or so, most of the issues that we've seen have been to the far left, right? People have been thrust into homes at the beginning of the pandemic. They were on, networks that didn't have to be as reliable as the office network in which they worked. They were competing for bandwidth with other people also thrust back into that house, whether that was your spouse or your children, competing for bandwidth. So that was a big challenge for sure. We also see a lot in that middle bucket, and I know you've sort of said this is an oversimplification, and we talked a little bit of this in the first use case where through that internet portion of the path, a lot of other things can come into play here, whether that's a VPN, cloud proxy, that sort of thing. And we're definitely seeing that as users come back to the office, that middle piece is starting to become the challenge where everyone's using Teams, which is great, but maybe the office wasn't designed to support everybody having Teams call through the course of their day, and now they're overloading or introducing a lot of latency across their ISP, for example.
Rob, could you show just a brief example using your product, just kind of show some of the end-to-end visibility so the audience can get a better perspective on when we talk about having end-to-end visibility, what's possible?
Absolutely. So let's use this Ottawa office workers example again. This time I'm going to drill into the infrastructure. And a couple things to point out here. One is, I mentioned there are, a lot of other factors that are in play here. I happen to be in the Ottawa office today. There's a number of network devices between me and the edge of the network that if those devices don't perform well, I'm surely going to have a poor Teams experience. So, one of the capabilities that we can pull in is I've got some Cisco devices here in the office that are being managed by a tool like System Center or SolarWinds or PRTG. So we can get that data included here to give a perspective in terms of what other factors might be affecting Teams experience for the Ottawa office workers. But the thing I want to really drill into here is getting a diagnostic view in terms of what does the path look like between users in the Ottawa office and the Teams data center. So much like when we went through the robots example, this is something that the software comes pre-packaged with in terms of mapping out what the network traffic looks like between a user or a location and the Microsoft Teams data center. So this is going to load up and I'm going to see the path between my Ottawa office. Again, this can also be targeted to individuals working at home, where we can see how their experiences and their network traffic is looking like as well. So here we see a hop-by-hop analysis. A little bit difficult to see what's happening, but I'm going to group this by who owns the segment of the network. And now I get a view that's somewhat in line with the slide we just saw, Nick, where I see, here's the office in Ottawa, going across our ISP through Bell Canada, entering the front doors of Microsoft into the data center. And along the path here, we get detailed analysis of round trip time, jitter, packet loss. Did we have any significant increases in those metrics as we go across this path? An example here, everything looks pretty good, but if we had an issue, we would see, while Bell is the bottleneck here, and we know that we've got a saturation of bandwidth perhaps, and maybe we need to upgrade our service with our ISP.
Great example here. Let's do this because we only got about 7 minutes left until we do Q&A. So I want to jump into the third use case a little bit here, and that's just you mentioned about early on, Rob, in case one, about as users were coming back to the office, you can begin to measure the impact. Like you can see the baseline and you can measure the impact as users come back to the office. In fact, you can click ahead and just show all four of those bullets if you want, Rob, just so they leave them right there's good. And one of this problem here is the idea of predicting then. If you can measure the baseline and you can see when I add 1 user or 2 users or 10 users or have some kind of good sample size, you can actually begin to predict what their experience is going to be like. And currently, that's one of the challenges for those of you in the audience is as your users return, you probably have no real ability to predict what's going to happen so that you can also then prioritize the problems. You saw Rob also talk about maybe proactively seeing that there's an issue affecting with these synthetic transactions, which is again simulating a user. If you're simulating at 3 in the morning and there's a problem with the Ottawa office, you can predict that when all the Ottawa users come in, there's going to be a problem in the Ottawa office. And so the idea here is you're basically predicting the experience and being able to prioritize where you need to be placing your focus. and then being trying to remediate those issues. Because one of the challenges here is you're trying to figure out, well, who's impacted. Now, something like the call quality dashboard to Teams defense is going to show you, you can see, who's having issues with a Teams call, that sort of things. You can get some of that. But if, again, it's one of those things where the user just says, Teams is down, one of those deals, I want to know who's impacted. I want to know what services are involved. I want to know the scope of this, that's kind of thing, where the root cause is. All of that kind of comes into play, as well as, is it something that I can remediate as an IT professional? Is it something where I need to, is it Microsoft and I just need to check the service dashboard and see and follow their Twitter feed and kind of figure out, is it actually up and down? Or is there something that I need to be aware of? Or is it something I can fix? Where you actually noticed in Rob's demonstration, I think maybe 2 times ago, he was actually showing there was a number of different network devices, and they were red. There were maybe there's literally a switch that's bad, at a particular office and that kind of thing here. And Cam, I'm going to throw a question your way. Just thinking about, you've seen lots of Teams problems, and I'm sure you've heard that sort of, what did you call it, Rob? Logo blaming, was that right?
Yeah.
So I'm sure you've been not the victim of logo blaming, but you've had to be the brunt of it as someone going, we're having nothing but problems. I mean, I've said myself, more often than not, it's not Teams. So, how much of this do you think of as organizations are going back to a hybrid workforce, in order to predict what's going on? Do you think they're going to need to have visibility outside of Teams so that there isn't this logo blaming going on?
Yeah, I mean, and yes, I've had logo blaming directed my way before by family, friends, other companies.
It's your fault, Cam.
Part of the gig. But I do think the important thing, and I really like the way Rob showed that visual representation of those various different data points of flow. Knowing what the problem is and being able to put that in front of folks that hold the purse strings to go and fix it, I think is essential, because you're going to be able to, rather than place a blame game, just say, here's the problem, and here's what we need to do to go and fix it. And if we went and fixed it, here's how we would not have to spend any more time on this problem anymore. And that type of tool set for IT these days, I feel like is absolutely essential. Like it's really informing the rest of the organization on what are the gaps and how to fix them and how to not have this happen again. And full stop, for sure, on occasion, Microsoft does have its issue, but playing that blame game of like Teams is just terrible today, that's never going to get you further down the path in resolving the issue. So I was super impressed by seeing the visualization of that tool, so that you just take the guessing game out of who's to blame, and you're just like, yeah, no, here's where the problem is coming from.
And I'd add to that, even if the problem is Microsoft, today there's a service down or whatnot, those of you in the audience, you still have then the benefit, hopefully proactively as much as is possible, an ability then to at least do something about it, where you can't fix the problem because it's out of your hands. Microsoft owns that, but at least you can then communicate with the affected users and then let people know ahead of time, Teams is having an issue, the video calls are bad today, whatever it is. And then at least now those people can try to accommodate and use some other means by which to communicate or postpone meetings or whatever the case is. So that's still helpful. Now, Rob, as the audience is seeing more and more users returning to the office, maybe you can show a couple of quick examples of how they can use this to sort of predict and prioritize in order to better address the issues that will come up with performance.
Absolutely. So I think, first and foremost, I talked a bit about the synthetic transactions and these robot users that are looking for problems, so that the robot finds the problem before the user does. And to your point, Nick, sometimes even if it's a Microsoft, one of those rare Microsoft outages, these robots are testing these workloads 24/7 every few minutes. So you'll get very, very early notification, often before Microsoft is even, announcing that there's something unavailable with one of their services. And if you're running an organization with tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of users, having that early ability to reach out to your employees and workers and give them guidance on what to do through the course of that outage saves a ton of time on the IT and support desk front. The other thing I wanted to jump into very quickly is some other dashboards that we have that slice and dice the data a few different ways, where you can start to look at trends across all of this data. So, one of the dashboards we have just gives a high-level view of all the activity that's happening across the organization. Who are the top users that are having particular issues? What are the top reasons that people are having issues? We can see where is activity happening in the course of the organization, day by day breakdown, the types of issues that your employees are experiencing. Are there even devices that are the root cause of a large group of issues, right? If there are older devices that are still out there in your organization that maybe aren't well suited to run Teams workloads, we could identify these here and see that maybe there's a bunch of Windows 7 machines still out there, that sort of thing. I know we're short on time, but a couple other scenarios I want to very quickly touch on. From a network perspective, right? Who are the, again, top users? What are the types of problems that we're seeing across the organization? Here within Ottawa, we see there's a lot of issues happening. Most of them seem to be Wi-Fi strength related. So, that alone already gives some guidance to the IT team here in Ottawa, what they should be focusing on to try and make our lives a little bit better in terms of our team's experience in the office here. Last but not least, one of the examples we hear quite a bit is around, user calls to IT or the support desk, complains about a poor experience. It's typically met with a, well, we'll get back to you because we don't really have all the data about you at our fingertips. With this dashboard here, let's just say Eric calls in with some problems. I can click on his, select his name here from the dropdown and get an overview of what does his experience look like. Let's pick a different, let's try this, Eric. And here we see, what has his good calls been? He's had a pretty significant number of failed and poor calls. So we know he is having some problems. Looks like all his calls are happening on Wi-Fi, for example. I can see where he's making those calls. And again, back to the example we just talked about, looks like most of his problems are related to Wi-Fi strength. So it just enables, IT support, whoever's answering these types of questions today, to be a little bit more informed in terms of what's actually happening with these users. And where can we go forward, whether that's to get the diagnostic view that we just showed in the last use case, to pinpoint where that problem is, but at least we have some data at our fingertips to help give that user some guided responses.
And just to clarify, Rob, even though I know this answer already, this is not just Teams specific. It's across all the Microsoft 365 platform, correct?
That's correct, yes. All the workloads, whether it's Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, et cetera, we have that capability.
Very good. So let's do this. Let's go through some questions. We got about 8 minutes left. And while we're doing that, you've got your next call to action for those of you that are in the audience here. If you'd like to take a demo, there's a URL there you can take a look at there as well. And let me first sort of generically answer one of the questions that a couple people answered. Said, how come this webinar is not on Teams? And it's funny because we had this conversation with Cam. Cam was like, why aren't you using Teams? He even asked. And we're like, oh, yeah. So oversight, I think, is the answer. Just human error, oversight, sort of a no-brainer. So I thought at least don't want to make sure we don't ignore that because you guys asked a really valid question. But that just didn't happen this time. But the Teams webinar ability these days, Cam, is excellent. Correct? I mean, we covered this, just an internal call. Correct?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like the webinar features for Teams are I want to say less than a year old for when they became GA availability. I love them. I'm definitely on a mission to host every webinar I can on Microsoft Teams. But I also, when I show up to be a guest speaker, even when we're talking about Teams sometimes, it can be hard to shift your webinar and external facing ways in which you deliver this content that is connected to your backend CRM systems. It takes a little bit of time to do that. So I never place blame for not using Teams for a webinar, but I certainly encourage everyone to use it. I think it's fantastic, and I will show up to do a demo of it anytime.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, and we got to see a quick demo. It was wonderful here. So, so a couple of questions here. I'm going to throw at you, Rob. Some quick hits. Jennifer saying, is Vantage DX available now?
Yes. This was launched in September. Customers running it now. Great response showing it at Ignite a few weeks ago. So ready to either demo it or spin anybody up for a trial.
All right. So Mohammed's asking, what's the requirement to gather all the data that you're showing on the carrier network latencies like Bell Canada, and how do you integrate with all of them?
So the network diagnostic portion that we showed is a small Windows service that would get deployed to the user's machine or a machine in the location if you want to measure that from a branch office, for example. It's a very light Windows service. There's no additional pieces to the puzzle, and it'll start mapping out the network traffic between that location and the team's data centers to present that view.
And then Cam, a couple questions for you. Andrew's asking, do you recommend 1 gigabit connections for organizations of 60 to 100-ish people?
I mean, yes, I recommend the highest possible bandwidth, and if possible, multiple entry points for physical location that you can do. I mean, if you look at what the data requirements will be for mesh when it gets here, they're going to be substantial, right? If you look at the way in which connectivity, even just on our cell phones from a 3G to 5G network, like the difference in the amount of data speeds that you get, it's massive. You know, sometimes it's better than a current office infrastructure, just on your phone, no matter where you are. So I would go with the highest bandwidth that you can that is affordable. 1 gigabyte per 500 or 600 users seems fairly reasonable. But I would say, like, invest the time to not just, if you're going to go do it, invest the time to think about not now, but 5 years from now as well, and what those requirements are going to be from a data perspective.
And just one other question for you, Cam. Ashwin's asking about as compared to on-premises Skype. Just wondering, does Teams use less or more bandwidth? I'm assuming for maybe voice calls as well as video calls.
It uses more, for sure. Yeah, it absolutely does. Like, it's a newer product. It auto scales, so it's going to auto scale your audio and video quality depending on the connection you have and the speed of that connection, for sure. Right now it goes up to 1080p, but you can imagine, as the product that's only about 4 years old continues to be used and expanded, and if you saw the sets of features that are coming on the roadmap right now, some of them are really cool and really exciting. But one day you'll get to 4K video. One day you'll get to 8K video. I'm not saying those are on the roadmap. They are not that I have seen.
One day we'll have Avengers video. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, if you think of the product evolution and where it's going to go, and then you agree that hybrid work and that experience is here to stay, then planning as far off into that future as you can is going to be worth your time and worth your headaches down the road. Like I said at the beginning, 75 million daily active users last year in November, and this year, over 145. So that's double. It's certainly worth planning for sure. But yeah, sorry, to answer your original question, bit of a diatribe. Teams does use more than Skype for Business.
That's all right, and that's a good, at least an honest answer. It's good. So, Rob, kind of twofold question. So Ronnie's asking about merging data from like SolarWinds. Jennifer's asking about pulling in data from other monitoring tools. I mean, can you talk a little bit about where you can get source data from and aggregate it together?
Yeah, so we provide out of the box a pretty wide variety of the most popular third-party management tools. And for those that we support off the shelf, it's largely a plug-and-play approach in terms of, if you want to hook up to, let's say, System Center Operations Manager, just point us to where the server's installed, give us some credentials, and we start pulling all the relevant data in. It gets auto-normalized, so you don't have to do any scripting or configuration work. You just decide what components do you want to put into your services. So, the application pieces that are being managed, network devices that are being managed, you just pin them into these services that I showed as part of the demo, and now their health, their state, the alerts that are associated are all correlated within our analytics platform. So we've got 25, 30 platforms that we support out of the box. It's also RESTful all in the back end. So if you've got some system that we don't support or a homegrown system, there's still options to perform some integration there as well.
There's a question here. I mentioned a little bit about PSTN. So Julie's asking about, can you monitor Teams and the use of PSTN calls?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that I went through, like those dashboards at the very end, we will show the breakdown of a VoIP call versus the PSTN calls, whether that's a calling plan, direct routing, or operator connect. And so we can provide a lot of the visibility in terms of, where are the problems happening? Are they the bulk of your direct routing users, or are they VoIP users? And then you can slice and dice and drill into those categories to get more detail.
And then I got another sort of technical question. I'm going to make this the last one because we're one minute before the hour. Ronnie's asking, and you might have to actually get with Ronnie afterwards because it's a little more detailed than this, but Ronnie's asking, can you show the overhead of running a VPN on a remote endpoint? And Ronnie goes into talking about the difference with the connection in terms of like TCP versus UDP. And so, I mean, you showed where, some of the the different hops on on the path from the endpoint to the Microsoft cloud. Can you do something and have some visibility into sort of that same thing from the VPN perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I made a somewhat vague reference to a case earlier when we were going through the use cases, but one specific customer example we had was a gentleman working in London, England, in his home, having a great experience with Teams, went back into his office, which had a persistent VPN back to Milwaukee, and his experience became rather poor. And actually used the network diagnostics capabilities that I showed you to identify, wow, you're actually reaching the front door at I believe it was in Chicago instead of London. And we were able to go through that exercise with the customer to identify that it was actually the VPN was the issue, and he needed to break out that traffic from his office.
All right, excellent. So it looks like we are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and sort of let us end on a high note here. There's a number of questions that have come in, and if you're typing a question right now, keep typing it. Someone from Martello will reach out to you directly and get your question answered, because there are a couple of them around things like cost and can you monitor this and those kinds of things. So definitely keep those questions coming. Someone will reach out to you afterwards and answer that question. Cam, thank you for being here today. Thank you for the input. Thank you for answering some of these questions. You had some great insight. I love having you here. It was a joy. So thanks for being here.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it was my pleasure. I love this stuff too. I think so many things as this hybrid experience comes to life at companies is like the flashy front end that everyone's talking about. This is like one of the most important pieces. It's just not the flashy piece. So I love an opportunity to talk about it because I think it's absolutely critical to the success of return to work policies.
And it shows. And Rob, another great webinar with you. Always appreciate doing these with you. So thanks a lot for being here as well and giving us a quick demo.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Had a blast, and I would echo your comments, Nick. Great to have you here, Cam. It was great.
And for those in the audience, again, thank you for your attendance today. Appreciate the questions. Again, someone will reach out to you and get that back to you, get an answer. We'll receive a link to a recording for the webinar in the next day or two or three, so be on the lookout for that as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close things out today. Thanks for attending today, and we'll catch you on the next webcast.